What's up guys, Houndish here, and today we're jumping in with another season of the Wish video, and in this one I wanted to focus on exotics for the season, and specifically, we'll take a look at the new exotic weapon. We do have details about the perks, also a little bit of information about how it will be acquired. So naturally there'll be a spoiler alert there. It looks like this will be yet another exotic that has multiple different upgrades, so we'll talk about that, plus we'll talk about a new exotic quest, acquiring the Thorn Catalyst as well as Dragon's Breath, and the quest to unlock the catalyst for that weapon. We'll also briefly discuss the lack of exotic armor this season, but additionally we'll break down a bunch of the exotic changes that have gone live in the patch notes. So if you're looking for exotic armor to pull out the vault, or indeed weapons, there are a bunch that are going to be performing pretty well despite the fact that we don't have new exotic armor this season. So a few things to break down early on in the season today guys. As always, I hope you find the video useful, but without further delay, let's get into it. And firstly, of course, we now have access to Dragon's Breath. I haven't used it a ton, but it seems like a fun weapon so far. And of course there is the Dragon's Breath Catalyst. The perk for that is called Pyromancer, and this weapon replenishes its fuel faster, and on top of that, defeating targets with the weapon causes them to periodically drop fire sprites. So it could be a pretty good one right there. Of course, if you want to get the catalyst for it though, you'll need to visit Banshee after acquiring the weapon from the Season Pass. And for a brief overview of the steps, firstly we need to recreate the Dragon's Breath Catalyst by defeating scorched combatants and bosses. And then the second step is to calibrate data and defeat targets while using Dragon's Breath, and calibration occurs when you complete Vanguard operations, Gambit, and Crucible matches, or seasonal playlist activities, and higher tier Nightfall completions, Crucible, and Gambit wins, as well as defeating Guardians, will provide additional progress. So not a particularly complicated catalyst to earn, of course, just maybe a little bit of grind involved. Speaking of grind, there is also the Thorn Catalyst, and looking at the patterns and catalyst collection, we can see that this one is indeed still earned in core playlists, so it's a random drop from Strikes, Gambit, or the Crucible, and we can see it grants plus 20 range and plus 10 stability, and the perk name is Refined Soul, and this grants bonus range and stability, plus dealing a final blow or absorbing a remnant grants additional increased weapon range, as well as increased mobility and handling for a short time. And on top of the other buffs for Thorn, which we'll touch on in a moment, it is actually a pretty juicy upgrade to the weapon, so let us know if you've been lucky and managed to pick up that Thorn Catalyst early on in the season. Now, of course, as we discussed, there isn't any new exotic armor in collections for this season. Certainly that's unfortunate. I think it should be a standard thing to introduce into any season or content drop in Destiny personally. Give us your thoughts about it down below. There are, however, going to be a couple of exotic weapons. We can anticipate that one of them will come from the new dungeon, but on top of that, a spoiler alert is necessary right here, as we do get extra details on the new exotic bow this season. So this is called Wishkeeper, and of course it is a strand bow. We saw that inside of the trailer. And there'll be a bunch of quests connected to upgrading this weapon, but the initial way of earning it is by completing the Star-Crossed mission. So this season we will see an exotic mission. That is at least something to look forward to. And for the bow itself and the perks, initially there is Snare Weaver, and precision hits and final blows build energy towards a Snare Weaver arrow that can be fired from the hip, and on impact, Snare Weaver arrows create a pattern of traps that suspend nearby targets. On top of that, it has Silkbound Slayer, and the weapon deals bonus damage to suspended targets, and we gain faster draw time for a short duration when suspending a target from any source or damaging a suspended target with the weapon. You'll notice the slight error on that perk description right there, but obviously with it being an exotic mission drop, it's probably something that we'll get maybe in the next couple of weeks, but it could also be later on in the season. On that front, we'll simply have to wait and see. But it's clear from looking at the database that this weapon will have multiple upgrades and different quests, featuring a handful of refits. So there'll be the Enduring Snare refit, the Hatchling refit, the Multi-Threaded Snare refit, and on top of that there'll be a Vorpal Weapon refit for the weapon as well. We can see as well that there are 4 different variants of the Snare Weaver trait, so there'll be intrinsic upgrades for the weapon, and presumably it's a craftable exotic. But it would appear there are different quests and steps for various upgrades, so there is Constellation Lock, Pair, Tower, and Wish. We can't see the objectives for most of those, but for Wish we can see we need to travel to the Dreaming City and then to the Gardens of Isilla to find the source of the Celestial Anomaly, where we'll reveal a hidden message and collect an inscription. And so these will be subsequent quests after we've initially earned the weapon. Nonetheless, cool to get a better look at the exotic, and I'd say overall actually it could be a pretty good weapon, but share your thoughts about it down below. Otherwise, that's pretty much everything that we can say about new exotics in the game. Obviously we might get a look at the dungeon one before it drops, but separate to exotics, just to point out, we can actually preview the Warlord's Ruin dungeon armor sets in game. I believe this is on the customization screen, but Destiny Bulletin shared an image right here of what they look like, so kind of an interesting theme for a dungeon, but give us your thoughts down below. Outside of those new items right there though, let's recap on some exotic updates that Bungie have also introduced this season for existing stuff. And so perhaps if you're returning to the game after a little break, it's certainly worth checking out Vex Mythoclast, and Bungie have said they've increased damage versus minor combatants by 10%, but it's also now doing 25% more damage against bosses and 200% more damage against champions when it's in the linear fusion rifle mode. So looking at some of the possible builds, artifact mods and things like that this season, it's definitely worth trying out Vex Mythoclast. On top of that, Revision Zero is also doing more damage against champions now, with an increase of 100%, so it's another weapon that could be a pretty good one to try out, especially in some of the harder content in the game. And then we get to Thorn, and of course that gets the new catalyst we discussed. And the rework for the weapon includes that picking up a remnant can overflow the magazine up to 40 rounds maximum, and then for the catalyst we get plus 20 range, plus 10 stability, and getting kills or picking up a remnant grants additional range, handling, and mobility. So Thorn just got a whole bunch better this season, but also there are the updates to the exotic glaives, and firstly, Winterbite has seen an increase to the detonation damage of the large projectile, and that's gone up by 25%. Plus, Bungie have said that the self-damage blast radius has been halved, with the self-damage itself actually reduced, so Winterbite is certainly another one worth trying out. And then of course, Bungie have reworked the class glaives, and these are the Witch Queen exotic glaives, and all of them now grant 1 ammo when you activate the perk, plus they no longer passively drain shield energy when you special reload to activate the bonuses, and that bonus is no longer deactivated by reloading or stowing the weapon. And then for the Warlock's Edge of Intent specifically, they've changed the effect of the healing turret projectiles to grant cures and restoration. They've also increased the AoE radius to 8 meters to benefit more nearby allies, and increased the magazine size from 4 to 5. And those changes pair with the ones we broke down initially. Plus, for the Titan's Edge of Action, passing through a bubble now grants bonus reload speed, handling, and a small amount of stacking bonus damage in addition to the overshield. But they have reduced the health of the bubble from 8,000 to 2,500, which is quite a big change, but they say it accounts for the increased uptime and the improved effects. And finally, there is the Edge of Concurrence for hunters, and the Lightning Seeker now jolts targets on impact. Plus, they've reduced the direct hit damage of Lightning Seeker to account for this free ammo granted. So the class glaives definitely have had a little bit of love right there. Plus for glaives in general, they've increased projectile speed by 30%, with an increase of projectile damage in PvE by 25%. So of course some of these changes will also affect the exotics. They've also reduced the delay after firing before you can melee from 0.75 seconds to 0.2, so follow-up melees will happen much faster, and they say shield energy now recharges passively when a glaive is held at a rate of 1% per second. Plus shield damage resistance is now tiered inside of PvP. So a pretty significant list of changes right there for glaives in particular. But also keep in mind if you want to check out some existing exotic armor in the game, and for Shards of Galanor, Throwing Knife now grants super energy ranging between 2.5 and 5% depending on the type of enemy killed. With the Ophidia Spathe, knife kills now grant a stacking damage bonus to throwing knives. And then on the Stompies, they've removed requirements to have full class ability energy to benefit from the movement bonuses. They also reduced the airborne lateral acceleration bonus, and it now provides damage resistance against combatants while airborne. On top of that, Mechanir Trick Sleeves allow the sidearm damage bonus to persist for 5 seconds after shields begin to recharge, with sidearm kills extending the damage bonus duration by 3 seconds, and reloading sidearms from reserves. So that's another good one to try out. And then with the Bombardiers, it now applies 20 slow stacks to enemy players and 40 slow stacks to PvE enemies. And on the Triton Vice, they've increased glaive melee damage bonuses while surrounded to plus 100 for both PvE and PvP. So that could be a fun one to play around with some of the glaive updates as well. But finally, Celestial Nighthawk allows precision kills to grant super energy ranging between 1.5 and 4.5% depending on the type of target. Then on the Titans, the Severance enclosure has been updated, and they've increased the size and damage of the explosion it grants. Plus, kills with the exotic's explosion will now trigger an additional explosion. And with Peregrine Greaves, players now have to be airborne for a brief time before the exotic effects will apply, but damaging champions, tormentors, or mini-bosses with a shoulder charge deals further increased damage and refunds melee energy. On top of that though, there's a rework to the Wormgod Caress perk, and they say the meter is broken up into 5 sections which provide escalating melee and glaive melee damage bonuses. The upper end of the meter also provides escalating weapon damage bonuses, but as the meter decays, they say it passes back through the earlier tiers rather than deactivating immediately. So another fun one to try out with glaives there, but then there's Ashen Wake, and fusion grenade impacts will now stun unstoppable champions. Plus on the Syntheseps, they say they've removed the extended melee lunge distance, but it now improves weapon handling and reload speed while surrounded. Plus they've reduced the PvE surrounded melee damage bonus, but increased the glaive melee bonus to 100% from 50%. So a mixed bag with that one, but potentially decent changes as well. Then finally for Precious Scars, kills with weapons matching the subclass now apply restoration. So Titans have had a fairly significant list of changes there as well. But finally for Warlocks and the Balador's Wrathweavers, Bungie say when you cast a Frost Pulse Rift, nearby allies gain a tier 2 stasis surge for 10 seconds in PvE and 5 seconds in PvP. Plus they gain a 50 health point overshield, and they say the stasis damage bonus provided to allies by Winter's Wrath Shockwave is now tier 4 stasis surge weapon bonus, and when the Winter's Wrath ends, you gain a tier 4 stasis surge weapon bonus as well. Then for the Apotheosis Veil, casting a super now grants Cure tier 3 for you and nearby allies, and after the super ends, you temporarily gain greatly increased melee and grenade regen for 8 seconds. Plus for Felwinter's Helm, they moved the size of the weakening burst and duration up 1 tier against all targets except for finishers against bosses, which retains the maximum size and duration. And finally for Karnstein Armlets, melee kills grant Cure tier 3 and Restoration tier 1 for 8 seconds, with finishers granting Cure tier 3 and Restoration tier 2 for 8 seconds as well. So a whole bunch of exotic changes overall really, and that's on top of course of the new armor, weapons, catalysts and things like that. But if you wanted a heads up of which things to check out in terms of changes, hopefully this bit of the video has been useful. And for today guys, that's what we have to speak about. So as always, I hope this one has been helpful. If it has, be sure to get subscribed and I'll keep you posted with more Destiny content. Give us your thoughts initially on Season of the Wish down in the comments section as well. But otherwise, I appreciate you tuning in today and I will catch you guys very soon.